Welcome back to the series on de-globalization. In this video, we're going to dive into the history of globalization. And just to recap, the goal for the video series is to provide some context to current events so you can make educated decisions about investing for the future. But forecasting the future of international trade after deglobalization without first examining trade before globalization is at best just guesswork. Mark Twain is famous for telling us that history may not always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. So if the globalization carpet gets pulled from beneath our feet and countries retreat back to their respective bunkers, then understanding trade before globalization should leave us with a trail of rhymes, at least enough to provide a preview of things to come. Okay, that's probably one too many analogies, but you get the point. History is important. So grab a drink and pull up a chair because we're going back in time, at least far enough to get a feel for how international commerce was conducted before the era of superpowers, multinational corporations, and the internet. All right, let's get started. The echoes of history offer more than just nostalgic reverberations of the past. They leave patterns and outcomes. And if we care to listen, those patterns and outcomes offer lessons for the future. Unfortunately, old lessons fade with time and old patterns re-emerge. And when it comes to issues as broad in scope as globalization, there's not much we can do to alter its path. But by understanding history, two things happen. First, we avoid being blindsided by events. And second, we can make informed decisions about how to approach the future. And current geopolitical tensions offer the perfect environment for reviewing lessons from the past. Deglobalization is slowly pulling back the curtain on the mechanics for global trade, and what it's revealing should come as no surprise. International trading relationships are complicated, especially when they're separated by oceans. Historically, oceans have served as a moat, a barrier of protection from potential enemies. They also serve as a bridge, a convenient link between distant partners. But the oceans are far too large to patrol when trading partners reside on opposite ends of the planet. At least that was the case before the United States Navy took on the task. For the last 75 years, the U.S. Navy has provided security for commercial shipping on the open seas. And with that security, the economics of shipping became such that any country could trade for whatever goods it needed at a cost that was effectively inconsequential. In fact, so inconsequential that the distance between trading partners became almost irrelevant. But the ambitions of Russia and China are combining to create fissures in that security. On top of that, the U.S. is slowly retreating from its role of policing the oceans. I'll expand on that a little bit later. So with geopolitical tensions on the rise and the U.S. withdrawing from the responsibility of protecting global sea lanes, commercial shipping is becoming increasingly less secure. And when that happens, geography matters. Again. And trade naturally reverts back to a more regional system of commerce, one that more closely resembles the environment before World War II. And that trend has major implications for investors. It's important to note that much of the deglobalization argument hinges on the U.S. retreating from its role of policing the oceans. And to be fair, there's some disagreement about whether or not that trend is real or imagined. I intend to make the case that it's undeniable. If actions speak louder than words, then U.S. naval strategy has a volume all its own. But even if the Navy were to continue patrolling the oceans, there are multiple national security threats, supply chain issues, and shifts in global demographics that all contribute to the unwinding of globalization. International trading relationships are far too complex and vulnerable to hinge on just one variable. Now, just to keep things simple, I'm going to divide the history of global trade into 3 time periods: pre-World War II, post-World War II, and post-Cold War, because each period can be identified by a distinctly different approach to international trade. Let's start with the pre-World War II era. We Americans tend to view Europe as the subcontinent of Eurasia, distinguished by its cosmopolitan people all living in peaceful coexistence. A bastion of culture governed by a friendly, liberal version of democratic socialism. But the history of Europe is anything but friendly. Underneath the veneer lies centuries of some of the world's bloodiest conflicts. And I think it would be an oversimplification to attribute those conflicts to cultural or multi-generational grievances, because geography plays a much larger role than do historical grievances. If there is one common denominator in the long history of European conflicts, it's the role geography plays in the competition for trade. And if you have any doubts about that role, just look at the history of the Mediterranean Sea. It sits perfectly between Africa, Asia, and Europe. For as long as humans have been navigating the oceans, the Mediterranean has been a primary trading route and a flashpoint for more conflicts than any other body of water. But here's the crucial takeaway. The geography of the last several millennia remains the geography of today. So as we slowly remove the guardrails that keep age-old combatants from killing each other, the grievances may no longer remain, but the geography does. And so does the nature of human beings. A more positive take on the history of trade is that, well, it was less complicated. If money makes people predictable, then so do natural resources, especially without an international code of conduct and the means to enforce it. And prior to World War II, that was precisely the situation. So, before globalization, everything was based on imperialism. If a nation was in short supply of iron ore, coal, oil, or food, and it had the military strength to impose its will, then it simply acquired the territory to get it. But the period following World War II shared little in common with previous chapters in world history. Before World War II, war had always left the defeated subject to the whim of the victor. As the old saying goes, to the victor go the spoils. But after World War II, everything changed. By most estimates, the war had left 70 to 80 million dead and reduced much of Europe to rubble. It was easily the bloodiest, most devastating war in recorded history. 80 years later, we tend to recall the devastation in the abstract, like grainy footage in a documentary. But at the time, it was a living nightmare, the likes of which the world had neither seen nor imagined. If there was ever a battle between good and evil, it was World War II. Germany and the Axis powers seemed unstoppable, and I think much of the nightmare lay in the fear that evil might prevail. So at the war's end, Western allies had no desire to dominate the defeated. Instead, we focused our attention on rebuilding them. It was a lingering lesson from World War I. Unfortunately, it took the atrocities of the Second World War to adopt a solution. In July of 1944, 730 delegates from 44 nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The gathering became known as the Bretton Woods Conference. The goal of the conference was to rebuild what remained of Europe and create a system to foster long-term global growth. After all, we needed a strong Europe to counter the rising threat from Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. With Europe effectively left in ruins, the United States stood tall as the world's largest surviving economy. Even more than that, it was the largest economy in human history. So naturally, we had the most influence in creating the terms for global trade. One of the most significant of those terms was the agreement that all countries participating in the Bretton Woods system pegged their currency to the US dollar. That role not only allows the US to borrow money at a lower rate, it also grants the US a very powerful tool of diplomacy: the power to impose financial sanctions. Not everyone remains happy with that arrangement, but there is no other currency with the credibility or the stable monetary policy to replace it. And despite the occasional moans and groans from the usual suspects, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, I don't see that changing in a meaningful way anytime soon. They've complained and even succeeded in circumventing the US dollar, only to be burned by their efforts. From where I stand, the stories are almost comical. After the war, Joseph Stalin was a pretty scary character, and he had an appetite for expansion. So there were serious concerns about the security of international trade. But World War II had left Europe's military in shambles. That was a problem, given that about 85% of international trade requires some degree of maritime transportation. After the war, the United States was by far the largest surviving navy. And when it came to manufacturing naval vessels, no one could come close to the production capacity of the United States. So it was understood that the responsibility for protecting transcontinental shipping would have to be shouldered by the United States. In fact, it was more than understood. It was a responsibility for which only the United States had both the financial resources and the military strength to provide. After the war, no other nation could sustain foreign deployments. So we accepted that responsibility, with one caveat. Participants in the Bretton Woods Agreement would have to side with the West against Soviet expansionism. And with that understanding, the United States became the primary agent of enforcement for global trade. We became the world's policeman. And that's largely been the case until the collapse of the Soviet Union. More on that a little bit later. So post-World War II, we had something that had never existed in human history. We had both an economic and a security system designed to facilitate global trade. The Bretton Woods Conference was a seminal moment in world history. While the landmark agreement took years to implement, it laid the foundation for what we now refer to as globalization. The post-World War II era was a period of incredible optimism, and it was the most prolific period in history, giving us the baby boomers. We tend to think of baby boomers as an American phenomenon, but there was a significant baby boom across Europe as well. The boomers were a massive labor force creating a glut of workers all competing for available jobs. When you apply the principles of supply and demand to that equation, you get downward pressure on the cost of labor. So the sheer size of the boomer generation played a major role in keeping production costs down and inflation at bay. Equally important to the economy were their spending habits. Boomer families bought cars, homes, and college educations. So not only did they contribute to lower inflation, they also created the demand for consumption-led growth. It's not difficult to see how a balance between the cost of labor and consumption-led growth is largely a function of demographics. Unfortunately, the global demographics of today are wildly different from what they were in the past. So the post-World War II era was a period of unprecedented global growth. With the Marshall Plan, money poured into rebuilding Europe, which not only provided economic stability, but also global access to the world's largest market of consumers, the United States. After the war, the U.S. made up about half of all the world's consumers. Access to the U.S. market helped Europe manufacture its way out from under the economic devastation of the war. In fact, most European countries returned to pre-war levels of production within just 5 years. For those countries, it was a period of massive industrialization. The post-World War II era was also a relatively peaceful period in world history, at least relative to the previous era of imperialism and world wars. Now fast forward to the 1980s, 5 years after the death of Chairman Mao, Deng Xiaoping, the so-called architect of modern China, set in motion the groundwork for 1 billion Chinese to flood the world with cheap labor, further pushing down the cost of manufactured goods all over the world. But in the late 80s and early 90s, A series of events led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And with that, the Cold War ended and the post-Cold War era began. In his speech to the United Nations General Assembly, Mikhail Gorbachev proudly declared, "No country today can be outside the international economy." And so the world gained access to an empire's worth of natural resources. In fact, the territories of the former Soviet Union make up the largest reserve of natural resources in the world. Access to those resources had a multiplier effect, reaching far beyond the European continent. Not only did it further push global commodity prices down, it also provided the resources to lift over 1 billion people from a life of subsistence farming to a more modern urban lifestyle. The unleashing of Russia's seemingly bottomless inventory of natural resources led to a dramatic decline in extreme poverty, and it helped generate record population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. But that kind of population growth doesn't come without its problems. Any disruption in the agricultural supply chain to those regions could have catastrophic results. It's a potential nightmare scenario that's best not left to chance. I'll touch on that topic a little later as well. With newfound access to resources from former Soviet bloc states, Brazil joined the club of industrialized economies. Brazil is now a top 5 producer of 34 commodities and the largest net exporter in the world. More to the point, Brazil is yet another example of the explosion in economic growth resulting from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the post-Cold War era was a period in which the economic stars aligned and globalization kicked into hyperdrive. Just look at the history of inflation after World War II. If you fast forward to the post-Cold War era of the 90s, you see how this period of hyperglobalization occurred with really minimal impact on inflation. Of course, there were hiccups along the way, but all things considered, it was a period of unprecedented global cooperation and exceptional economic growth. It was also a period during which we saw the rise of democracy and the decline of communism. And free market capitalism dramatically outperformed economies driven by governments with an obsession for centralized control. But there is a threat to this historic growth that for some countries could very well lead to economic decline or even collapse. It's a threat that's been building over decades and may be getting close to reaching a point of crescendo. And that threat can be summed up in one word: demographics.